In July 2026, a photograph 19 years old started trending again. A grainy shot of Lionel Messi, 20 years old himself at the time, laughing in a bathtub with a chubby, oblivious baby in his arms. The baby's name was Lamine Yamal. Nobody planned this coincidence. Nobody could have. But 3 weeks ago, in a World Cup final in New Jersey, the baby Messi once bathed lined up across from him, and this time, Messi's team lost. Here's how strange that photo really is. In 2007, a Spanish newspaper ran a charity raffle for UNICEF. Win a photo shoot with Barcelona's players for a calendar. A family from Mataró won. Their baby ended up in Messi's arms for 30 seconds, splashing water, completely unaware he was being held by a player who would go on to become the greatest of his generation. That baby had no way of knowing he'd spend the next 2 decades chasing the same trophies, and that one of them, the biggest one, he'd end up winning against the very man who bathed him. Nobody at that photo shoot could have predicted any of it either. Not the photographer, not the newspaper running the charity raffle, not Messi himself, 20 years old and still years away from his first Ballon d'Or. It was a 30-second favor for UNICEF, forgotten by almost everyone the moment the calendar stopped being printed. It only became a story at all because 2 decades later, both people in that photograph turned out to be generational talents, standing on opposite sides of the same World Cup final. But the photo isn't really the story, it's just the hook. Because what actually happened to Lamine Yamal between that bathtub in 2007 and that stadium in 2026 is a story his own club barely talks about. One that has almost nothing to do with talent and almost everything to do with the family that kept him standing. Start with his name. Lamine Yamal isn't just a name, it's a thank you note. His parents named him after 2 family friends, Lamine and Yamal, who helped them financially in the months before he was born. Before he had ever kicked a ball, his identity was already built on debt and gratitude. His mother, Sheila Ibana, was a waitress from Bata, Equatorial Guinea. She had Yamal when she was 16 years old. His father, Munir Nasraoui, was a building painter from Larache, Morocco, who Yamal has said would go out and hustle, picking up whatever he could find on the street just to bring food home. Therefore, the family that raised him wasn't one household. It was 3 generations improvising. His paternal grandmother, Fatima, had come to Spain alone, sneaking onto a bus from Morocco, and worked morning, afternoon, and night shifts just to save enough to bring Yamal's father over to join her. His mother made a similar journey from Guinea with her own grandmother. 2 immigrant bloodlines, arriving in Catalonia from opposite directions, converged in a neighborhood called Rocafonda. When Yamal's parents separated during his early childhood, it was Fatima who held things together, managing his daily routine, making sure he got to training, anchoring a kid who had no fixed address. "We always lived in the typical way," Yamal has said. "A friend would lend us a room, and that's where we stayed." This is not the biography of a prodigy discovered in a mansion. This is a kid who was passed hand to hand by people with almost nothing, all of whom decided he was worth the sacrifice anyway. And it's why, when Barcelona's academy scouts first saw him play as a small child in Mataró, the club didn't just sign a player. It inherited a debt to an entire family that had already spent everything it had on getting him there. Rocafonda itself matters here. It's one of the poorer neighborhoods in Mataró, a working-class port town outside Barcelona. Not the kind of place that regularly produces Ballon d'Or contenders. Yamal has never hidden where he's from. If anything, he's leaned into it, treating the neighborhood as part of his identity rather than a chapter to skip past on the way to the good part of the story. Compare that to how most academy prospects get discussed in football media. A tidy narrative of scouted talent, structured coaching, supportive infrastructure from age 6 onward. Yamal's actual path looked nothing like that template. It looked like a kid showing up to training from whatever room his family could borrow that week, somehow still good enough, every single time, to make it impossible for Barcelona's coaches to ignore him. Which is what makes the next part of this story so cruel. Because just as that debt was about to pay off, just as the kid from Rocafonda was 1 tournament away from becoming a World Cup champion, his own body nearly stopped him. In April 2026, 3 months before the World Cup, Lamine Yamal tore his hamstring. Not a tweak, a tear. The kind that ends seasons and sometimes tournaments. It happened at the worst possible moment, in the stretch run of Barcelona's La Liga campaign, right as Yamal was putting together the best individual season of his career. 24 goals, 18 assists, and the youngest La Liga Player of the Year award in the competition's history. The injury sidelined him for the rest of the club's season. For weeks, nobody outside Barcelona's medical staff knew if he'd be ready for the World Cup at all. Spain's coaching staff said publicly that he was on track. Privately, there was no guarantee a 19-year-old hamstring heals on a federation's schedule. He raced back. He made the squad. He started the tournament. But the fear never fully left. 2 nights before the World Cup final itself, Yamal was seen limping out of training, a heavy wrap around his thigh, after a collision in the semi-final win over France. The same leg, the same injury, threatening to return at the worst possible hour. Think about what that means for a 19-year-old who has never played a senior World Cup match before this one. Every other storyline around him was about talent, about magic, about being the most exciting teenager football had produced in a generation. But in the 72 hours before the biggest game of his life, the actual story was a body that might not hold up, a leg that could give out at any moment, on the same stage where his family had spent 19 years just trying to give him a stable place to stand. Not everyone agrees on how a story like this should even be told. Some fans find it moving, proof that talent from nothing can still reach the very top of the sport. Others push back hard on the whole genre, arguing that publicly dissecting a teenager's family trauma and poverty for views crosses a line, turning real hardship into content for people who will never know what it actually cost. Yamal has never asked for either reaction. Both keep showing up anyway, every time his name trends. Nobody would have blamed him for playing scared. A World Cup final, a recently torn hamstring, the weight of an entire immigrant family's sacrifice riding on his legs holding together for 90 more minutes, maybe 120. This is the kind of pressure that has broken older, more experienced players. Spain's medical staff cleared him. Luis de la Fuente, the manager who had built his entire defensive identity around discipline and caution, made the call to start him anyway, betting the biggest game of his own career on a teenager's recently repaired hamstring. It was the kind of decision that looks obvious in hindsight and reckless in the moment. He walked out anyway. Lamine Yamal played every minute of that final. The hamstring held. He didn't score the winning goal. That was Ferran Torres in the second period of extra time. But he was on the pitch for all 120 minutes of the night Spain became champions for the second time in its history. And Yamal became a World Cup winner before he'd even played a full senior season of Copa America or Euros football to his name. Therefore, that photograph from 2007 stopped being a coincidence and became something closer to a circle. Months before the final, Adidas had already leaned into the connection, releasing a commercial where Messi writes a letter to Yamal, both of them tied together by the same boots, the same brand, an unspoken passing of a torch neither of them had asked for. Nobody involved in that campaign could have scripted what actually happened next. The letter's recipient beating its author in a World Cup final. On the same night, Messi almost certainly played his last one. Here's the detail that makes this land harder than it should. Yamal wasn't just a bystander to Messi's story. He was, quite literally, part of it. Bathed by him as an infant in a stranger's calendar shoot, mentored from a distance by his career, chasing the exact records Messi spent 2 decades setting. And when the moment came to be on the opposite side of history from him, Yamal didn't hesitate, didn't shrink, didn't play it safe on a leg that had betrayed him 3 months earlier. Spain's second World Cup wasn't won by one player. It was won by a defense that conceded almost nothing all tournament, by a coach who bet his career on players nobody else wanted, and by a bench full of guys who grew up further from comfort than most fans will ever know. But the image the world will remember first is the kid from Rocafonda, raised by 3 generations of women who crossed borders with nothing, standing on the same pitch as the man who once held him in a bathtub, and refusing to lose. Messi will likely never play another World Cup. Yamal, barely 19, has potentially a decade or more of these tournaments still ahead of him. Which means the photo that made this story go viral again in 2026 might not even be the last time their two careers intersect. It might just be the first chapter anyone bothered to notice. Yamal wasn't the only player on that Spain roster who grew up with almost nothing and ended up a world champion. Standing next to him for most of that final was a winger whose parents crossed the Sahara Desert on foot to get to Spain in the first place. That's the next story on this channel. Subscribe so you don't miss it.